I think you
It's
need a hug.
okay.
Can I hug you? That's the
I've
exact
got you.
sentence a little girl whispered on a
Everything is
freezing
going to be
Christmas
all
Eve
right.
to a stranger who looked like she'd forgotten what gentleness even felt like. And no joke, that tiny moment, one kid, one hug, one broken woman sitting, alone on the church steps, was the spark that flipped everything that came after. The whole city felt like it was wrapped in ice that night, the kind that crunches under your boots and creeps into the cracks of your bones. And the church at the corner of Maple and Third glowed like it was trying to offer a little bit of warmth to whoever needed it most. People were rushing inside for the evening service, their breath swirling like little ghosts in the air. But nobody noticed the young woman curled up beside the doors. Nobody except a 7-year-old girl, with mittens shaped like bear paws and a heart way too big for her age. The woman's name was Marin, though she hadn't said it out loud in days. She was bundled in this thin, beat-up coat that looked like it had seen more winters than her, and her fingers were red from cold. Wrapped around a folded letter, she kept reading over and over like it was the last piece of her old life she still believed in. Her hair was messy, her cheeks hollow, and she had that faraway look, like someone who'd been walking through storms for so long she forgot what sunlight felt like. But then this little girl, Lila, came bouncing up the steps, dragging her dad behind her. And suddenly she stopped dead in her, tracks like her heart recognized, something her brain couldn't explain. She looked up at her dad, then back at Marin, then let go of his hand and climbed the steps, like she was answering some mission only she could hear. Marin lifted her head, surprised, eyes full of exhaustion, and Lila just opened her arms and asked to hug her like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And even though Marin didn't move at first, something in her face cracked. Like the kind of crack that happens right before a person finally lets themselves breathe. She nodded barely, and Lila stepped forward, wrapping her tiny arms around this stranger, who'd been lost in her own silence for way too long. And the wildest thing, Marin didn't just accept the hug. She collapsed into it. Like that hug was the first soft thing she'd touched in months. People passing by slowed down, some pretending not to stare, but you could feel the shift in the air. And standing just a few feet away, Lila's dad, Daniel, watched the moment unfold with this stunned, almost protective look like he realized something important was happening, something he couldn't quite name yet. He didn't interrupt, didn't pull his daughter away. He just let the moment breathe, and none of them knew it yet, but that hug wasn't just kindness. It was a reunion waiting to happen, a reunion nobody knew they needed. End hook. Because right as Marin pulled away, something slipped from her pocket, something that made Daniel's entire face go pale. It was just a tiny piece of folded paper, nothing special at first glance, the kind of scrap you'd expect someone living rough to carry around. Creased edges, smudged ink, maybe a little rain damage. But when Lila bent down to pick it up, holding it out with her little mitten hand, Daniel's breath hitched in this quiet, stunned kind of way. He didn't even know why he reached for it. Didn't know why his heart thudded a little too hard against his ribs. But the moment his eyes landed on the name scribbled across the top, it felt like the world jerked sideways. Because he'd seen that name before. He'd said that name before, in past tense, in grief, in conversations you whisper, because saying it too loud hurts too much. Marin Whitlock, a name that didn't belong on a church step, a name that belonged to family. But he didn't say anything, not yet, because Marin didn't notice the scrap of paper, didn't notice the shift in Daniel's face. She was too busy trying to wipe her cheeks with shaky fingers, embarrassed that she'd cried in front of strangers. She tried to apologize, voice cracking, saying she didn't mean to scare anyone, that she'd leave right away. But Lila squeezed her hand and told her, in that innocent voice only kids have, "You don't gotta leave. You look cold. Daddy has Coco." And Daniel, who usually kept people at arm's length, especially strangers, just nodded and took off his warm scarf, draping it gently around Marin's shoulders like he'd done it 100 times. Marin flinched at the contact, not because it hurt, but because kindness had become so foreign it almost stung. Inside the church hall, the noise softened into carols and murmured conversations. Warm lights flickered, candles glowed, and the smell of cinnamon and cocoa wrapped around them like a blanket. Daniel held the door open, silently asking Marin to come inside. She hesitated, because when you've been out in the cold long enough, warmth feels suspicious, but Lila tugged her sleeve again. Please, just until your hands stop shaking. And Marin, for once, didn't argue with the universe. She followed. But here's the thing. Daniel wasn't watching her walk in because she looked lost. He was watching because Marin's profile, the slope of her nose, the scar on her brow, even the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, all of it looked like someone he once loved, someone who vanished without a goodbye and left a hole in the family they never filled. And the scrap of paper in his pocket felt like a heartbeat. And Hook, because deep down, Daniel already knew this wasn't just a stranger his daughter hugged. This was someone who wasn't supposed to be alive. If you've ever watched someone walk into a warm room after surviving months of cold, you'd recognize the way Marin stepped over that threshold. Slow, careful, like she wasn't convinced any of it was real. The church hall glowed with soft gold light, little strings of bulbs draped over the wooden beams, people laughing over warm cocoa and cinnamon bread, all wrapped in that cozy Christmas Eve buzz. But Marin stood just inside the doorway, clutching the scarf Daniel had given her, looking like she might bolt at any second. She didn't even know where to put her hands, or her eyes, or her heart, because she'd been holding herself together for so long that comfort felt almost dangerous. Daniel kept a respectful step behind her, watching quietly, trying to pretend he wasn't studying every inch of her like a man, trying to solve a puzzle he wasn't ready to admit he recognized. Lila tugged Marin toward a little table near the fireplace, right in the warmest spot in the hall, and plopped down like she owned the place. Sit here, okay? She said, patting the chair next to hers. Marin sat slowly, shoulders drawn in, eyes flicking around as if someone might tell her she didn't belong. Daniel placed a cup of cocoa in front of her, and for a split second her face cracked, just a tiny amount, but enough to show how long it had been since someone handed her anything without expecting something in return. She whispered, "Thank you," barely audible, like she was scared the word would break apart. As she wrapped her hands around the cup, warmth spread through her palms, up her arms, right into her chest, and you could literally see the tension loosen. She took one sip, then another, and a small, shaky smile appeared, quick, almost shy, but real. The kind of smile people give when they suddenly remember what being human feels like. Daniel sat across from her but didn't make small talk right away. He just watched the way she held the cup, the way her eyes softened at the fire, the way little details of her face looked painfully familiar. At one point, Marin started humming under her breath, this soft, almost ghost-like melody. Lila perked up immediately. "Hey, I know that song. My grandma used to sing it," she said, bouncing in her seat. Daniel's eyes snapped up. That same lullaby, that same melody. His stomach dropped. And Hook, because the moment Marin said, "My mother used to sing it too," Daniel knew it wasn't a coincidence. Not even close. Daniel tried to play it cool, tried to pretend this wasn't rattling him down to the bone. But the more Marin spoke, the more the past crept into the room like a shadow taking shape. She told them she used to teach kids music once upon a time, that she knew how to fix old instruments, that she loved harmonies and winter, songs, little fragments of a life that didn't match the beaten-down woman sitting across from them. Lila, in her usual sunshine way, kept firing off questions. Did you have a mommy? Did she make cocoa like this? Did you sing together? Do you play piano? Do you like snow? And Marin actually laughed, soft, breathy, surprised at herself because no one had cared enough to ask her anything in months. She said her mom was gentle, that she used to braid her hair before school, that music was their secret language. And when Marin said she lost her years ago, her voice cracked. Daniel's hands tightened around his cup. Then Lila noticed something, the tiny silver pendant around Marin's neck. She reached out, touching it gently. "It looks like my grandma's necklace. She had a music note, too." Marin froze, fingers instinctively covering the pendant as if protecting a fragile memory. She whispered, "My mom gave me this when I was 12. It's the only thing I didn't pawn." Daniel felt something twist inside. Him, recognition, dread, hope, grief, all tangled together. Because he had seen that exact pendant style before, years ago, sitting in a jewelry box that belonged to his mother, a matching necklace his older sister used to wear before she disappeared. He excused himself for a second, pretending he needed more napkins, but really he stepped into the hallway and pulled the folded paper from his pocket, the one Lila had picked up outside. He unfolded it again. The handwriting, the name, the short message on the back that looked heartbreakingly familiar. Marin Whitlock, a name they'd put on missing persons lists. A name the family cried over, prayed over, fought over. A name spoken only in quiet rooms where grief had settled like dust. It was impossible. And yet she was sitting 10 feet away, warming her hands by a fire she should have been at years ago. Daniel stepped back into the hall, pulse hammering, because one question now screamed louder than all the others. Why had Marin disappeared in the first place? And even more terrifying, what would happen when she realized who he was? And Hook, because before he could say anything, Marin looked up at him with eyes full of fear, like she already knew he'd figured out something she never wanted uncovered. If you've ever had that gut-deep moment where the truth is so close you can feel it breathing down your neck, that's exactly what Daniel felt when he walked back toward the table. Marin's eyes locked onto his like she could sense something shifting in the air, like she knew some part of her past had just clawed its way back into the present. The fire crackled behind them. People laughed in the distance. Carols played softly through the old speakers, but none of it mattered. The only sound Daniel really heard was the thudding in his chest as he set the folded paper on the table, right in front of her. "This fell out of your pocket," he said, voice steady but carrying, a weight only someone holding back a tidal wave of questions could manage. Marin's face drained of color. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for it, like she already knew what name he'd seen, what name she'd tried to outrun. She whispered, "Please don't ask me about that." But there was something in her voice. A tremor that wasn't fear of him, but fear of memory. Lila looked back and forth between them, confused, clutching her mitten like she could squeeze answers out of it. Daniel tried to soften his voice, but the truth was squeezing his ribs. "Marin, why does this have the same name as my sister?" The air snapped. Her head dropped. Her fingers tightened around the paper like it was a piece of her she wasn't ready to give up. And for a second she looked so small, so breakable, that even Daniel's frustration cracked into concern. She shook her head slowly. "Your sister's gone," she whispered. "She's been gone for years." Daniel swallowed hard, because that was the thing. They all believed she was. They held a service. They mourned. They waited for a body that never surfaced. He whispered, "We never found her." And that sentence hit Marin like a punch to the ribs. She pressed a palm to her chest as if steadying her heartbeat. "You weren't supposed to," she said, voice trembling. "I didn't want to be found." And that's when the story she'd been burying started clawing its way out. She didn't hide behind excuses. She didn't try to make herself sound innocent. She confessed, voice raw. After their mother died, she broke, fell into a toxic relationship with a man who isolated her, manipulated her, then abandoned her in another city with no money, no ID, no one to call. She tried to get home, tried to reach out, but shame sank its claws into her. The guilt grew heavier than the distance itself. "I thought you'd all be better without me," she whispered. "I couldn't bring my mess back to your door." Daniel's jaw tightened, not in anger but heartbreak, because all those years he thought she'd chosen to leave. She was barely surviving. Lila climbed into Marin's lap, tiny arms around her neck, whispering, "You don't gotta hide anymore." And for the first time in years, Marin couldn't hold herself together. She cried, not silent tears, but the kind that come from a place that thought it had lost its right to feel. End Hook. But just as Daniel reached out to comfort her, a shadow suddenly appeared in the doorway, someone who recognized Marin before she ever said her name. The man standing in the doorway had that stiff, cold look of someone who's seen a ghost and doesn't like what he sees. He wore a heavy work jacket, snow clinging to the sleeves, and his eyes locked on Marin like he'd been hunting her shadow for months. "There you are," he hissed, stepping inside with a slow, deliberate swagger that made the tiny hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stand. Marin's spine went rigid. Her breathing quickened. Every ounce of warmth she'd found in that church evaporated the second she saw him. Daniel instinctively rose from his chair. Positioning himself between the man and the two girls like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Do you know him?" Daniel asked. Marin didn't speak. She just nodded barely. Her lips trembled. "He's the reason I disappeared," she whispered. And the way she said it, broken, terrified, was enough to make Daniel's stomach drop. The guy smirked like he had some kind of ownership over her story. "She owes me," he said, loud enough for the entire hall to quiet. "She ran off with things that weren't hers." Marin shook her head fast. "I didn't take anything. I left because I wanted to live." But he stepped forward anyway, ignoring her words, ignoring her fear. "You're coming with me," he growled, reaching out like he had a right to grab her. That's when Daniel stepped fully in front of him. Shoulders squared, voice low but razor sharp. "Back up." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The entire room watched, breath held, as the man narrowed his eyes and tried to size Daniel up. "You don't know what she's done," he barked. "Actually," Daniel snapped back, "I know exactly who she is." And then, before the man could get another word out, Pastor Mills moved in, 2 church volunteers flanking him. They weren't big guys, but they had that protective energy that comes from people who take care of their own. "Sir, you need to leave," the pastor said bluntly. "Now." The man scoffed, spat something under his breath, then stormed out into the snow, but not before pointing a final finger at Marin. "This isn't over." Doors slammed shut behind him, and the whole hall fell quiet. Like the air itself was holding its breath. Marin collapsed into her chair, shaking so hard she had to grip the table to keep steady. Daniel kneeled beside her. "He's not touching you again," he said softly, but with the kind of conviction you can't fake. And Lila wrapped her arms around Marin's shoulders, whispering, "You're safe now. Promise." Marin looked between them, the child who offered her warmth, and the man who had just shielded her from the nightmare she thought she'd never escape. And something shifted in her. Expression, hope, just a flicker, but real. And that's when Daniel finally said it, voice low and steady. "Marin, I need you to look at me." She lifted her head, eyes full of tears. She was tired of crying. Daniel swallowed. "I'm your brother." Her breath stopped. The world froze. End hook. Because the moment she whispered, "No. No, you can't!" Everything she'd been running from and everything she'd secretly longed for came crashing back at once, the second the words, "I'm your brother," left Daniel's mouth. The whole world inside that church hall seemed to freeze, like even the twinkle lights hanging across the beams held their breath. Marin's fingers slipped from the edge of the table, her legs trembling, as if the floor beneath her had suddenly turned into glass and every step she ever took to escape her past cracked beneath her feet. The room felt too small, too bright, too loud with nothing but silence. She shook her head as if trying to break out of a dream she didn't trust. "Daniel?" she whispered, her voice thin as if the name itself tasted too painful to say. "No, no, my Daniel is gone." But Daniel didn't move, didn't blink, didn't step back. He stepped closer, slowly, like approaching a wounded animal that wanted help but didn't trust anyone enough to accept it. "Marin," he said softly, "I'm right here. I never stopped looking for you." And those words broke something in her, something she had welded shut years ago. Her knees buckled. Daniel caught her before she hit the ground, and she collapsed into his arms like she'd been waiting years to be held but never believed she deserved it. Her sobs weren't soft, they were sharp, gutted, shaking her whole body as she clung to him, like she was afraid he'd fade if she let go. "I'm sorry," she cried into his coat. "I'm so sorry I left. I didn't know how to come home. I didn't know how to face you." Daniel wrapped both arms around her, holding her tight enough to keep her from falling apart. His voice cracked. "You didn't have to face anything alone. You were never supposed to." Lila knelt beside them, tiny hands pressed against Marin's arm, whispering, "See? I told you hugs fix people." A shattered laugh escaped Marin through her tears, and for the first time, the sound wasn't hollow, it was human, wounded, but alive. Pastor Mills stepped forward, placing a warm hand on Daniel's shoulder. Family finds its way back, he murmured. Sometimes in the most unexpected places. It took minutes for Marin to sit up straight, wiping her face with the back of her hand, breath unsteady but clearer. Daniel didn't let go of her hand, not once. Come home with me, he said quietly. You don't have to explain everything tonight. Just come home. Marin looked terrified, terrified of hope, terrified of being wanted, terrified of being believed in. What if I'm too broken? She whispered. Daniel shook his head. Then we rebuild, together. And with Lila tugging gently at her sleeve, Marin finally nodded, slow, hesitant, but real. The kind of nod that felt like a miracle happening in slow motion. And Hook. But just as they stepped out into the snow, headlights swerved across the parking lot, and a voice shouted Marin's name with venom that froze, Daniel's blood. The man from earlier stumbled out of the truck, half drunk, half furious, snow and diesel fumes rolling around him like a storm. You think you can run again? He barked, stomping across the ice toward them. You think you can hide behind some church people? Marin instinctively flinched behind Daniel, and that tiny movement, so reflexive, so full of old fear, ignited something primal in him. He stepped forward, shielding her with his body. You're done, Daniel said, voice low, steady. Dangerous in the way only a man who finally has something to protect can sound. You're not getting near her again. The man scoffed, trying to puff himself up. She owes you nothing, Daniel snapped, taking another step forward, forcing the guy to stumble back. Snow crunched under Daniel's boots like punctuation marks. She doesn't belong to you, and she's not alone anymore. The man's eyes flicked nervously between Daniel's stance, the pastor standing behind them, and the two volunteers stepping onto the porch ready to intervene. For the first time, he looked outnumbered and outpowered. Then Pastor Mills pulled out his phone. Already calling the police, he announced calmly. You might want to leave before they arrive. The man cursed under his breath, rage boiling, but, realizing he couldn't win, he spat in the snow and backed toward his truck. This isn't over, he growled. Daniel didn't even flinch. Yeah, he said, stepping forward one last time. It is. The man peeled out of the lot, tires skidding on ice, disappearing into the dark. Marin sagged in relief, knees wobbling, breath shaking as if she'd been holding it for years. Daniel's arm wrapped around her without hesitation. He's gone, he said softly. For good, Lila squeezed Marin's hand. You're safe now. Forever safe. Something in Marin's face shifted, like the first crack of dawn after a long winter night. They drove home slowly through the snow, and when they reached Daniel's house, a warm, quiet place glowing with soft lights, something in Marine's chest loosened. Inside, she froze at the sight of a framed photo of her and Daniel as kids on the mantel. Her breath hitched. Daniel set a hand gently on her back. I never took it down, he said, because I never stopped believing you'd walk. Through that door, Marin covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of being found, tears of being welcomed, tears of belonging. Lila tugged her toward the couch. Can you stay forever? She asked. Marin knelt, pulled her into a hug, and whispered, Yeah, sweet girl, I think I can. Later, the three of them sat on the couch, blankets wrapped around them, the fire crackling softly. Daniel looked at his sister, not the girl who vanished, not the woman who suffered, but the person she was becoming again. Tomorrow, he said gently, we'll figure out the rest. Tonight, we just breathe. Marin leaned her head on his shoulder. Lila curled into her lap, and for the first time in years, the world didn't feel like something she had to survive. It felt like something she could live in again. Final end hook. Because sometimes, the family you think you've lost isn't gone. They're standing at the top of snowy church steps, ready to take your hand the second you're brave enough to reach back.